Twitter used to make $5 billion a year, and it makes a quarter of that now under Elon Musk. Elon Musk, you can be the richest guy in the world and still have a void inside you that needs filling.
Bruce Daisley is one of the smartest thinkers on the future of work. He used to run Twitter UK and YouTube UK.
I was working on YouTube before there was the idea of a YouTuber. I previously was the European Vice President for Twitter.
He's got great phrases like gentrification, and he explains why we're spending so much more time in meetings.
Good cultures have got that strong sense they're all in it together. One of the things that can help that all in it together is when you feel like there's a common enemy, and it might be the libs are your enemy if you're Donald Trump.
What do you make of the way that Elon Musk is taking the platform?
It's just...
Make sure you subscribe so we can continue to get bigger and bigger guests. Bruce, welcome to Jimmy's Jobs.
Thank you.
What is your job, Bruce?
Now, these days,
Yeah.
I act as a workplace consultant. I sort of help companies with their company culture. I previously was the European Vice President for Twitter, and when Twitter was Twitter, and I previously was the country director for YouTube in the UK.
So when did you start working at YouTube then?
I started working at Google that owns
Yes.
YouTube in 2012.
Okay.
And about a year later, I was fully working on YouTube. So I was working on YouTube before there was the idea of a YouTuber,
Yes.
YouTuber. There wasn't YouTubers when I was there. So people were starting to create content, put content up there. But the way that we understand YouTubers now hadn't existed and didn't exist at that stage.
Really interesting time to be there. What made you want to join the sort of technology sector in 2012?
Tech obsessive.
Yeah.
I'd been the first person I knew to get the internet at home.
Yeah.
You know, when the internet was maybe something that you had in school or in your office or in a library, but you know, I was one of the first people to get it. But before actually people even knew what you would have the internet for. But I loved buying books off Amazon when it was just the US.
Yeah.
There was the equivalent of Amazon in the UK was Book Pages, was nowhere near as good. But in the US, we forget these little things we take for granted now. But you could buy American books that weren't available over here. So if you found a novelist you liked, and you know novels were really big then, or a comedy book you liked, you could buy books from the US that you could not buy in the UK. And so it felt like this incredible, wondrous thing.
And so why did you make the jump to go and do what you do now then as a kind of like workplace consultant?
Yeah, so I worked at YouTube. I built a sort of team. Hard to imagine, but YouTube, when I first worked on it, we had a team of 5 people, then a team of 10 people, then a team of 19 people, then a team of... And it was growing gradually. And YouTube was a pretty small... It was a big place for people to consume things, but, you know, there hadn't seemed like there was a need for a big UK office. So that was gradually building. And the thing my team became famous for inside Google was we had a lot of misfits in it. We had a lot of sort of people that were handed to my team by the rest of Google. You know, Google was quite management consultancy. It was quite Bain, it was quite McKinsey.
Yeah.
It was like these suits that would turn up at meetings with clients. The guy from Google's here. It was quite Scientology-like a little bit. And quite often when I was building my team, a lot of people would just hand me their worst performer, saying, I hear you're building a team. I've got someone really good for you. And they were just, but what we found was that team of misfits, because I was able to encourage people that they could be themselves. We had one guy who just discovered he loved making every presentation really funny and into like stand-up comedy and audience participation. And we're like, yeah, go for it. And my team of misfits became quite famous inside the organisation. Only team that played music. We had pop music playing behind our team. And our team looked quite different to the rest of the culture there. And it became quite famous inside the organisation for looking a bit different. Anyway, I got approached to go and work at Twitter. And it was probably like, it's hard to rewind the clock now, to imagine that Twitter was quite a joyous product to use, quite a fun thing to use. And it's probably the only place I had the best job in the world, right? Running YouTube.
Yeah.
And Twitter was probably the only place I would have gone. And they said along the way, will you come to San Francisco for an interview? And so I booked some holiday. I went to San Francisco for the interview. And they said, you're going to meet the chief exec. Well, who? If you're the fan of a product, who wouldn't meet the chief exec of Twitter? Former improv comedian. You know, I'm in a company that probably at the time was 350 people, went up to 400 people by the time I joined, so it was growing quickly. But you're meeting these people, you're like, oh yeah, these are really good people.
Yeah.
Anyway, but my team in Twitter, worked there for 8 years, became quite famous for the culture of it. And, you know, always collaboration, that is. It's always, you know, the biggest people, the heroes of the team become the culture. But along the way, I sort of became obsessed with culture, because for us at Twitter, it was a really big differentiator. We had fewer employees than our rivals. We were never going to be able to, you know, we had more work than we could do in terms of, you know, whether it was Gary Lineker or the likes of Gary Lineker wanted a meeting, maybe then program makers wanted a meeting, politicians wanted a meeting, advertisers wanted a meeting. We had more demands upon us than we could cover. And the people from other companies had way more people. So, but we were like, okay, we're smaller, we're less likely to matter, but if we can build a culture that's a bit differentiated, maybe we can perform better. It became an obsession. And, you know, in a company like Twitter, you have as many times where the culture's struggling because times are hard as the culture's doing well. But what we found was, because the culture was like a big differentiator for us, people would stay through the hard times, or they would be motivated to turn things around when things got bad. And so I became obsessed with culture, especially when times are hard, obsessed with it. I was always interested in it. I was obsessed with it as a differentiator. And after I'd been at Twitter for about 8 years, doing an international job slowly kills you from the inside. You know, you're traveling, you're eating junky food, you're up at 4 a.m. to get a 5:30 flight. You're constantly exhausted. And so after 8 years, I was like, yeah, that's enough.
Yeah.
And people had written a book about culture that had done quite well. I'd started a podcast on culture that had done quite well. And so people were already contacting me saying, oh, would you come and do a bit of culture work with our company? And so that was the plan, really. So I quit 2 months before COVID. That was not the plan. But the plan was, okay, let's see if I can build a business doing that. And everyone who worked through COVID will tell you there was more than a degree of making it up as you went along, you know, surviving through that. But that's how I do. That's how I do the work I do now.
Was it quite a good time to quit? If you'd known that COVID was coming, do you think you would have quit and sort of launched this venture?
I used about 2 years to write another book.
Yeah.
So like I tried to use that book Fortitude, about resilience. So I used some of the time productively. Then I found that, you know, people after the first 3 months were like, okay, we want a keynote presentation to our team about staying happy at work or staying motivated when you're working remotely. So there was a degree of improvisation where it was like, okay, yeah, I've got content I can do on that.
Yeah.
So, you know, set myself up with a nice camera setup, and I would do talks into companies for that. But it was, you know, making it up as you go along to some extent, in a way that now I've turned that into something far more structured. But at the time it was, you know, guesswork.
Do you view yourself as a content creator? I mean, you said earlier, you know, you were at YouTube before YouTubers existed, but a lot of what you do is sort of create content around culture, I suppose.
I don't necessarily see myself as a content creator.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done 200 episodes of a podcast. So to some extent, my job description is content creator, but I don't see, because most of my content isn't me talking to camera, trying to impart my own wisdom. It's more, you know, like this, sort of asking people and trying to draw. So even though like the books I've written are created in collaboration with all the people I've spoken to. They're sort of a synthesis of all the things I've done. I wouldn't necessarily see myself first and foremost as content creator.
What is the thing that most companies get wrong about culture? I mean, I'm fascinated by it as a thing, and I think it's interesting how much it has changed with the pandemic, because I think a lot of culture was built on the office and the walls and so on of the buildings that people were in. What is the most common thing that people get wrong about their culture?
Two things that spring to mind. So I think that while we associate the last 10 years with the pandemic, and it did fundamentally change, the place we do our work was never a perceived variable, right? You didn't. If your friend told you they had a new job, then it would be certainly done at the same place they went for the interview, right?
Yes.
There was no debate, and you'd be there 5 days a week from 9 till 6. There was no debate. We only realised in the pandemic that place was a variable, right?
Yeah.
And so we become obsessed with when work doesn't feel the same now as it did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we're obsessed with, that's because we're not in the office a lot. The big thing that's changed in the last 10 years is the amount of time we spend in meetings has trebled. And most of us find ourselves with a Slack thread or a Teams thread that needs an immediate answer right now. The insistence of messaging apps are quite greedy, actually. They demand our attention. That's a way bigger change to the way we worked.
Yes.
The continual partial attention that most of us have, that none of us feel able to concentrate on anything, that there's always something that's sort of pulling at our sleeve saying, will you answer this? That's a way bigger change. If that hadn't happened, then the location we did our jobs would feel very, very inconsequential in comparison. So
it's almost the new jacket on the back of the chair.
Right.
It's sort of the Slack channel that needs answering.
Right. Now, the second thing about workplace culture is the thing we mistake is the number one predictor of whether you're engaged with your job is whether you have a best friend at work. And that's the specific wording on it. So they've tried to change it to close friend, and it didn't produce as good results. So it's a strange. Some people feel uncomfortable with the idea of having a best friend at work. But I think what it communicates, I always think of it, that people want to feel seen at work, and they want to feel seen by their bosses. They want their work to be noticed, and they want to feel seen by their colleagues. They want to feel understood. Quite often, why does a best friend matter? Because after a bad meeting, you want to go moan at someone. Or when you've just been asked that you need to do this by the end of play today, you just want to use a couple of swear words on a friendly ally in the office. And I think we miss that. And what's happened to work over the last few years is that the opportunities to create friends have gone down.
Yeah.
People who work hybrid report at the lowest level of people having a best friend at work. And I don't think that comes with the territory, by the way.
Yeah.
I think you can have a best friend and only see them once a week. I think you can have most of our real life best friends we probably only see once a month, right? There's not a given that the amount of time we spend. But I think these are the things we misunderstand. Work has become greedier, more interruptive, and fewer of us have best friends at work now.
That's a really interesting observation. Talking about culture and the skills, you made an interesting observation earlier where you sort of had the kind of misfits in various teams and so on. Have you watched Slow Horses?
I have.
Yeah, it's a bit like that. I can totally see how that sort of works. But how do you help people find their special skill? If you believe that somebody's got it in, you were talking about the person who was good at making the presentations funny and engaging, for example. How do you go about trying to unearth that hidden talent within someone?
Quite often, if you create an environment where people feel that they can show their weird side, especially if you're surrounded with, we used to have a Friday afternoon meeting. I wouldn't do it Friday at 4:30 now, but we used to have a Friday at 4:30 meeting. And anyone who wanted to be funny quite often would put their hand up and say, can I host that? And so, very often you would get, so it was hosted by anyone in the company. We would include funny things that happened that week on Twitter. So we had a bit of humour baked into the format. We would have something inspiring that someone had used Twitter for, a member of the public, or a campaign that week. So pride is a really big part of our motivation for jobs. And so immediately it created like these anchor points of funniness and pride. But what we found really quickly is that, you know, quite often when you hire an employee, they've got a weirdness to them, but they don't want to show it until they feel comfortable. You know, and it might be the music they're obsessed by, or the way they prefer to dress, or the things that they're interested in. And they often sort of conceal those things. But when I think you're in an environment where other people are demonstrating their weirdness, then they feel more comfortable to do it. There's a product method who make the cleaning product, but one of the things that they say is their value is keep method weird. And they try and ensure that there's an opportunity for people's quirkiness, for people's weird...
Excuse me. Speaking of quirkiness, just sneezing in the middle of the podcast.
So they try and ensure that there's an opportunity for people to show their weirdness, their quirkiness. And I think what happens is when you see other people doing those things, you're comfortable with doing it. So we used to have, you know, quite a lot of the team were members of this male voice choir. And so I think they were a gay male voice choir. And so they put on a couple of performances in the fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And so there were just little elements like that where people felt like, oh, it's not just, you know, that sort of try to bring yourself to work. We wouldn't use that phrase, but people's weirdness was very much on display.
We should come on to that and the person at work, because obviously we were on stage the other night with the Squiggly Careers ladies, and we had a bit of a sort of like back and forth on how much of that should come to work, which would be interesting to go into that. What?
We can insert it.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll probably put the podcast out as well, right? So like we'll include that in the intro. But we will come back to that, because I just wanted to ask first. But do you think business has got a bit too serious? Because I think that's really interesting. You talking about the funny stuff there, and I'm a big fan of it. And like when we try and do our live shows, we actually get a stand-up comic to do sort of 10 minutes before, like somebody who's up and coming and whatever, just to get people kind of like lightened up and so on. Because you know it's quite serious, the stuff we talk about, jobs and workplaces, etc. Right? It doesn't lend itself to comedy, but it is one of the things that I just think there are a lot of these events that I sort of go to, and you'll have been to them as well, right? And they're quite sort of, black and white, right? And I just think that business is fun. Business is really exciting.
Two things. So firstly, culture lives in the gaps between things, right? So if you've got no gaps, then it doesn't live. So, quite often it's a really interesting thought experiment to say to people in your team, how many hours a week are you in a meeting today? Or say to yourself, quite often senior leaders will have 2 hours a week that they're not in meetings. And there'll be something flashing in their calendar that they should be at, but they're not going to go to. And there's a training session they're meant to be dialed into, but they're not going to go to. Culture lives in the gaps between things. So in the old days, what that looked like was you went to the Red Lion afterwards, or you went somewhere afterwards, and it lived there. The truth is, not everyone can do that. Not everyone wants to do that. But culture lives in the gaps between things. So you see it. When teams have lunch together, their culture is better. It's very rare that you find a good culture where there's not some degree of sociability. Right.
Yeah.
So two parts, that plays a sort of a big part, the culture living in the gap between things. I think the second thing for us to understand right now is that, has it got too serious? Well, yeah, when you're very heavily scheduled back to back, you've got relentless demands on you. There's just no scope for play and experimentation and joking around. So look, it's really interesting. Little thought experiments. Quite often, organisations have the only way they've found the way out of the way they're working right now is experimenting. So there's a lovely piece of research, which is organisations that introduce meeting-free days. So let's have a look at what that might look like. That might be, we're in the office on Wednesdays, but it's meeting-free Wednesday. So that doesn't mean that you can't meet anyone. In fact, you can. You can do the old-fashioned thing of chatting over the table. Yeah. Or you can you're allowed to put in your own diary, you could go for a walk with someone, grab a latte, go for a walk. You can put all that in yourself, but the company will not put anything in your diary on a Wednesday. Bosses won't, it has to be bosses. Managers won't, but you can do what you want. The companies that did it, and 70 organisations did that, there had to be at least 1,000 people, so they weren't just tiny organisations. And they said, people said, it's the best day at work. It's the day that feels like the old days. It's the day that we actually laughed quite a lot. We all had lunch together. And what it shows you actually is that you can design cultures far more than you imagine. I always think, compare the way we use offices and the way we use calendars. The way we use offices is you would never just allow the first people to arrive to put desks around.
Yeah.
No, because you want zones that represent welcome, there's no reception, meetings, quiet, desks to get work done. You intentionally design it. When it comes to calendars, it's the first come, first served. We don't allow people to demarcate that there's a meeting free Wednesday. We don't allow people to say there's a deep work Thursday morning. It's just come and get it.
Yeah.
In fact, if you work in an organisation where everyone's calendars are open, people just spot you've got a gap and they fill it.
Yeah.
And it's just really interesting that we all get obsessed with productivity. We all get obsessed with why isn't the country producing more? And yet, the reason why the exponential increase in technology that we've shipped to people in the last 15 years hasn't been matched with productivity growth is because we're working in such a unplanned, unstructured, ill-disciplined approach. So until we think about the technology that we've had in the last 15 years, productivity should be off the charts. And yet we are applying it in such a slapdash way that no one's getting the upside of it.
I think that's so true. That point about calendars is really interesting in terms of the way that you can just send it to external organisations as well. Really, it's quite sort of like
you can put a to-do item on anyone's to-do list.
Yeah.
If I sent you a meeting invite, there might be a degree of affront if it was an outside company. But if I sent it to a colleague, people would be going, "Yeah, what's this meeting about?
Yeah.
Do I need to prepare anything?" They just take it as given that they will be turning up to your meeting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of crazy when you think of it like that. I wonder, when did that sort of start, really? Because I remember at number 10, I had somebody who looked after my diary and all that kind of stuff. And I remember somebody sending me a calendar invite and being from an outside organisation. And I remember being really kind of sort of thinking, gosh, that's very strange. I just wonder when it sort of started.
The interesting thing is talking to academics about it, because I spend my time reading academic research about what's happening in work, the studies. Academia doesn't do it. Academia doesn't share calendars. So quite often you get these people in academia professing that they know what the future of work looks like, here's this. And I'm like, just so you know, your experience of work does not look like the corporate world. So quite often you hear academics saying, "Yeah, I love my meetings. It's a good opportunity to hear what students are working on, or it's good opportunity to get ready together with the department." It's like, that is not the experience of someone who works in a service industry or a sales industry or a manufacturing. That is not where their experience. Their experience is, relentless meetings, often where they don't say anything. They unmute to say nothing from me this week.
Yeah.
So I think there's a challenge of it. And the critical thing is, organisations need to say, the best way to do it is that normally it comes to sort of gravitational consequence of as organisations get bigger. So the more you can make teams slightly more self-contained. Yeah. Jeff Bezos, when he was first at Amazon, said, "I don't want teams to communicate with each other." That was a really interesting difference, because now we're living in a world where unless you've communicated with other teams, people feel that you haven't done your job well. Yeah. Have you told that team about that? Did you communicate your plan? Did you go round everyone else's meeting telling them? That's how we're meant to communicate. Actually, if you took a step back and said, how do people consume content now? Most young people don't read a lot, but we send them emails. Yeah. We invite them to really boring meetings where they watch someone presenting slides while they're doing their social media. So, probably the business skill we need to be thinking about is, can you create a 2-minute video that communicates what your team's doing? Yeah. And send it and say, can I ask that you've watched this? Can you confirm when you've watched this? And it just requires slightly different skills, right? I mean, anyone under 25 in an office can make a TikTok, but you wouldn't necessarily think of creating a corporate TikTok of what you're trying to do. And it's, to some extent, it's applying the skills that are very easy, the tools that are very easy, to the way that we do our jobs.
I agree. I do think LinkedIn might change it in 2025 just because they're pushing video so much, and it's quite interesting on lots of that side. But I'm with you. Like, even though that, I probably would consider myself a content creator, podcaster first, etc., I still don't like doing the kind of like holding the phone up and doing it to camera and whatever. And it's just a generational shift, right?
Yeah.
Like, because anyone under 30 kind of is comfortable doing that, and they do that with their friends all the time as well. It's not even necessarily in a public public setting. So it will be interesting how that kind of impacts things in due course as well.
Are you a fan of Jimmy's Jobs of the Future? Hi, I'm Sonny, one of the producers behind the show. Have you ever thought, my business deserves to be in the spotlight too? Well, you're not alone. Companies reach out to us all the time, asking us to create podcast and digital video content for them. But until now, we've only taken on a limited amount of projects. But here's the good news. In 2025, we're expanding. Our production company, Boxlight, is now ready to help more businesses like yours tell their stories with high-quality, white-label content. Curious to see what we can do or how much it might cost? Head over to boxlight.io. You'll find examples of our work and even a podcast calculator to explore your options. That's boxlight.io. We'd love to help you shine in 2025. Now, back to Jimmy.
I want to talk about status and kind of employer brands, because you were sort of working there in the tech sector in almost the kind of like glory decade of when it was sort of like exponential growth and so on. But then there was a bit of a tech lash kind of that started in 2016 as well. So we'd be interested to kind of get your thoughts on that, but also what you're seeing and what you're reading about what the next status of employment is. So my view on this, and I think it's pretty common, but is like in the 2000s, lots of top graduates wanted to go and work at investment banks, work in the city, etc. That shifted in the following decade, post-financial crash, partly as well, to people wanting to go and work at technology companies, and a bit more on the kind of like consultancy side, McKinsey, Bain as well. Where do you think that's going to head next?
Yeah, look, I think broadly, the simple rule is the best candidates want to work at the best brands. And so, yes, technology was where they ended up, but Google was becoming one of the biggest brands in the world. Tech brands were the brands that became famous. Apple was the most famous brand and most desirable brand in the world. And there's a simple rule, which is, and it's not always the case, but the best people work at the best brands. Mm-hmm. So what I mean by that is, and you can do it once, but any firm might say to themselves, we've hired the Google woman. We've hired the Google guy. Right. And what's that shorthand for? That's shorthand for we've hired someone from an elite company. So it acts as a sort of good shortcut, and it means that normally, certainly as you're going up your career, you try and trade up performance to work at a better brand, right? It's not always the case. Some people love working at smaller companies, but if you're in the TV industry, you want to go and work at the best production company. Yeah. If you're in tech, you want to go and work at the best tech firm. You want to trade up brands because it makes your job easier, makes your job more alluring. People answer the phone more.
I think it's particularly important, actually, as you were saying that early on in your career as well, when you're sort of more kind of driven amongst peer groups from university and school that might be doing different things, that it becomes a sort of even bigger driver, actually.
Yeah. And so you get this really strange situation, actually. A lot of people went to work at Google or Meta or big companies, and what they find very quickly is they have no autonomy in their job. Yeah. So what you get is really interesting affluenza, where their material benefits are good. At Google, at Meta, you get your lunch given to you every day. You can go and pick and choose it. Yeah, and as someone who never had that, before I had it, it's like I was like, every day I was like, don't take this for granted. This will go. They'll get rid of this next year. Like it was baked into me, having worked in companies that had cost cutting. It was like, this isn't going to last. But so you have this material wealth, but and look, you know, what you frequently find is that your job is so repetitive, unrewarding, lacking in any agency, that you've got this this real sort of contradiction running through people, where they're like, all my mates say to me, I can't believe you work at Google or Meta. I can't believe you work at Apple. And then inside you're thinking, yeah, if you knew what my job was, I don't get any intrinsic satisfaction from this. I'm not inspired by the work I'm doing. And so what you get quite often in people who work in big tech firms like that, they're in states of managed depression. And I guarantee it because I've seen it firsthand.
There's that quite funny thing, wasn't there? It was a meme ages ago, right? Even pre-coronavirus, but it was like, what my parents think I do, what my friends think I do, what society thinks I do, and what I actually do. Like, we should bring that back. I think it's a really, it's a really good, it's a good point. And what was your job, right? Like, I'd be quite interested in that, because there was a perception sometimes of like, you know, what are these kind of UK, European offices doing, right? Because surely all the kind of like big decisions are taken out on the West Coast, etc. I mean, obviously
so let's look at Twitter, right? So Europe, Middle East, and Africa, job of Twitter. And so my job was broadly three things: reputation, audience, and revenue. So reputation, when Angela Merkel was coming to the end of her tenure, we were like, okay, well, President Macron is going to be the power in Europe. Mm-hmm. We don't have a relationship with President Macron. Let's get Jack Dorsey. Let's get us in front of Macron. So we met Macron 3 times in a year.
Right.
Because we were like, if he see Jack's like slightly different to your classic Silicon Valley guy, sort of a bit more yoga hippie-ish, and so we were like, if we make President Macron thinks, yeah, I'm kind of mates with Jack Dorsey, it adds to his credentials, and it also adds to our opportunity to try and differentiate ourselves versus Facebook. Big focus for us. They were. At the time, there was a lot of that narrative about the social network movie, a lot of Cambridge Analytica, a lot of what they're doing with your data. We didn't do any of that. We never took people's data. We never tracked people. So, great. If we can juxtapose us, right, so reputation, big. How can we grow our reputation in UK, in France, in Germany? Each one of those places. Audience, Twitter was never as big as Facebook. Yeah. Latterly, Instagram overtook us, but you know we were bigger than Instagram for a while, and so it's like, okay, what are the things that drive? And it was very unevenly distributed. Really big in UK, really big, huge in Japan, huge in the US, quite big in Spain. And so it's like, okay, why aren't we as big in Germany? Because the thing that characterises Twitter is that football seems to grow it. They love football in Germany. Yeah. But it's quite private. Twitter's open and public. Germany, because a third of the country used to be East Germany, they're quite private. And so constantly you're like, okay, what could we do to make it bigger in Germany? Right, so audience. And then final one, reputation, pays the bills. You know, Twitter used to make $5 billion a year. And it makes a quarter of that now under Elon Musk. But, you know, how do we make VW want to advertise there? How do we make Coca-Cola want to advertise there? So audience, reputation and revenue were the 3 jobs, really.
And what were those meetings with Emmanuel Macron like? I mean, he was putting a huge amount of effort into making France seem more startup-friendly, technology embracing and so on. So that was where he was kind of coming from. So what was kind of in those, what was discussed in those meetings? Was he asking for advice? Yeah,
look, your goal, same with, David Cameron meeting or whatever, is that you're trying to humanise your demonstration. You're trying to have a dialogue with them, actually. So, in a meeting like that, you don't turn up with loads that you want to necessarily say, but you've got maybe a couple of points that you want to get across that, our attitude is this. We're comfortable with regulation.
Yeah.
We're comfortable with, beware of simple answers to complicated problems is one of the things you try and communicate. Quite often politicians, the nature of politics is reductive. You want a headline. And the general lesson on the internet is beware of simple answers to complicated problems. So the moment you say, we're going to ban social media in Australia for young people, right, let's start imagining the unintended consequences of that. What I imagine will happen, because we've seen it in some US states that try to ban TikTok or adult content, is young kids get very good at using VPN products very quickly. And all of a sudden, you've gone from something that was inside the realms of regulation to now we have no control over what content they see, because now they're logging on like they're in, a different island republic somewhere. And so beware of unintended consequences. And so, lessons for things like that is you're just trying to humanize your sense of connection, to warn people. You're trying to sort of build a connection. So our job in those meetings was make sure that Macron feels that he can call the head of France whenever he wants.
Yeah.
Right. You've built something there. So I didn't go to some of the meetings with Macron because I wanted my head of France and Jack Dorsey, to look like these are the two guys.
Yeah.
If he starts calling the European guys, we've failed. I don't speak French, and we want it to feel like we've not sent two comms people, two public policy people. We've sent Jack Dorsey and the guy who's running France for the first meeting. It's feels really intimate. Feels like you can sort of have this discussion with them. So things like that, really, just trying to curate moments.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, obviously, sort of having sat the other side of it as well, sort of having a conversation about, what is intended by those meetings is interesting.
But you'll note the other way as well. I bet you've worked with tech firms and 8 people come into the room.
Yeah, definitely.
And what you end up,
this is a classic meeting
right.
status thing.
And what happens with that is you end up thinking, oh my God, they travel mob-handed, don't they?
Yeah.
And it's so bureaucratic, that company. You can see the culture in the fact that 2 people carriers had to bring them to the meeting.
Yeah.
Whereas our intention was, okay, Jack's a guy you can talk to, he's a savant of the space, and the guy from France, basically he's facilitated this. So it meant from my position, I wanted to make sure that I don't need to insert myself in that discussion.
Yeah.
It works way better strategically if it looks different to the meeting we have with Facebook, where you've got a lawyer there, you've got someone there, it feels like an intimate coming together of 2 big leaders. And so curating those things is really important, I think.
It's really interesting. What was the thinking at Twitter on Mark Zuckerberg's famous comments about the Twitter guys have driven a clown car into a gold mine? I mean, it's a great turn of phrase.
Fantastic. In fact, it's probably too good. It gets attributed to him. I suspect someone inside the organisation, his organisation, said it, and he copied it. Yeah. So the quote is, the guys at Twitter have driven a clown car into a gold mine. Yeah, I mean, look, you'll know, you've worked in big organisations, small every organisation from the inside is a bit clown car-like.
Yeah.
Every organisation is, if people outside knew the chaos that was going inside, they probably wouldn't use your product. They probably wouldn't eat your food. They probably wouldn't, it's sort of a big part. And sometimes at a place like Twitter, the chaos was on the outside as well as the inside. Yeah, I mean, look, it was a fun place to work because it was quite maverick. We didn't have the obsession with being the biggest or making the most money that Facebook had. And it's probably why Facebook are one of the biggest companies in the world and Twitter isn't,
Yeah. No, fair. You've not held back on Twitter itself, but I mean, what do you make of the way that Elon Musk is taking the platform, etc.? What are your thoughts on it?
I feel a distance from it. Social media quite often is captured by a moment in time. Anyone who used Twitter during the London 2012 Olympics will remember it was joyous. You were laughing through it. 6 months before that, Twitter had been quite helpful in the midst of London riots. So,
Yes.
there's moments in time where Twitter 2012 was very different to Twitter 2022, or Twitter 2024, X 2024. And so you can't romanticize like a moment in time because the moment's passed and people behave in a different way. I think, for example, when I joined in 2012, within 3 years, Donald Trump was using the disintermediation that Twitter had allowed him to speak directly to people to become Republican nominee. And at the time, people were like, "Oh wow, this is a sort of subversion of the ethos that Twitter had." But he'd recognised, I don't need to win the approval of the New York Times. I don't need to win the Washington Post because I can talk directly to people. The way I'm expressing myself in a quite sort of human way is cutting through compared to Jeb Bush, compared to some of the other candidates he was up against. And so he used that tool really effectively. But it meant that already by 2015, Twitter was a different product to work on, different place to work on than it was in 2012. By the time he was president, people were saying he's just threatened to nuke North Korea. What are you going to do about that? And, not that I'm remotely defending that, but I often used to draw people's attention to a cover of the Washington Post where President Obama threatened to nuke North Korea.
Yeah.
It's like, all presidents have their bellicosity. All presidents have like their saber rattling. Just the means of distributing it has changed. So, things change over time. Look, Elon Musk, unfortunately, it's really interesting that you can be the richest guy in the world and still appear to have a void inside you that needs filling, right?
Yeah.
And he's, the fact you can't use that product without seeing tweets from him. He's determined to insert himself into everyone's timeline. It's just a bit exhausting. I don't use it anymore. I go on there occasionally to search things because there's still more content on there related to tennis I'm interested in or areas of the world my family live in. So sometimes I go in and check those things, but he's just made it quite toxic, I think.
I'm using it an awful lot less. I find it sort of quite sad. I am using LinkedIn, I have to say, a lot more. I think that is kind of where it's going. But then I stopped using Facebook years ago as well. So you're right, these things do just, they change and whatever, but I thought I would have to sort of ask you about it. You're also an honorary visiting professor at Bayes, which I was just quite interested by because it's sort of one of the things that I think that we don't have enough kind of like business education in the UK. Like, what's the job there? What does that involve, etc.?
Yeah, look, I spent my time reading business university papers, academic papers published. And what the interesting thing is that quite often you go into environments and the business papers present a version of work that's different to the lived reality, but also there's no return. I remember when I was first studying it and I found that open plan offices correlate with really low productivity. I was like, no one's told the people who are working in open plan offices because we're all in them. And it's just crazy that the research has been done. And so it's really interesting that there's no exchange of information. You've got these researchers doing this and the world of business aren't doing this. And so I was like, I guess if I see my role as anything in terms of, it's like trying to bridge that gap. So reading these papers and thinking, how can we apply that all the time? And so, Bayes, I love Bayes Business School, the sort of, as part of City University. And so I love, they invite me along, teach a module in the MBA or teach a session for graduate students, for undergraduates. I love sort of coming along and talking about some of the challenges. So quite often it's good to go in there and say, like, let's imagine you're running a social media product. Anyone, when they're running it from home, managing it from home in their head would be like, I could solve this. And you go, okay, let's imagine how you would run that social network or how you would run this company, because the decisions often aren't quite as easy as you imagine.
Yeah.
People always used to say, oh, you've running social media. But why don't you just stop people
Stop people being
swearing?
nasty.
Yes,
Yes. Just stop.
and like, what you take them through is that you can do that, but this will be the unintended consequence of that. And you can do it.
Yeah.
You know, there were times where it's sort of quite unsavoury, but there were MPs receiving rape threats, horrible, the worst use of social media. And so someone would go on the news saying, I don't even know why they let the word rape on there. It's like, okay, right, let me illustrate to you how people are using that word. So 90% of the uses of that word are song lyrics. So, you know, there's a Nirvana song with that title. Or frequently people were saying, I'm on my way to rape TK Maxx. Now, whether you think that is a good use of vernacular, that is someone on a bus heading into town talking about them going to buy it, spend a lot of money. And if you tell that person you can't use that word anymore, they will immediately go, please state I'm being prevented.
Yeah.
And so, or people would say, again, horrible, sorry to use this again, but they would use that word about, I'm going to come around and play you on FIFA and I'm about to...
Yeah.
Now, all of this might be unsavoury language, might be language that we would not want our families to use, kids to use. But if you start policing that, then I think people will go, this just seems a bit heavy-handed. Right, so these unintended consequences for some of the things you can do. And I think, you know, making people realise that it's far more nuanced, that these simple soundbitey answers aren't always necessarily going to achieve what you want. So, you know, I love going into a business school and taking someone through case studies and things like that.
Taken through the case studies. In the acknowledgements of the book, which I listened to it, but there's a great... You talk about the kind of platform on that freedom, which I was just really kind of struck by. So what sources do you use?
Okay, that was Sci-Hub.
Yeah.
Sci-Hub I mentioned there. So you know, like what you find now is that the world of academic papers is an interesting racket because the journals that publish those papers cost thousands of pounds to subscribe to them. The academics don't get any money to put their papers into them.
Yeah.
And what's happened in the last few years, there's been a bit of a revolution where most people are putting their papers online for free, or you can request their papers for free. So until now, it's felt like this sort of walled garden, this very expensive garden around learning, where the academics would love people to read it for free. And so my comment was about that, really. You know, like, actually, if we want psychology to have an impact on work, then you can't hide the psychology behind these sort of fiefdoms where no one actually is benefiting other than the person who set that fiefdom up 150
And that's a
years
British
ago.
and American thing as well, right? It's not just...
More and more papers are now available almost freely. So if you go to Google Scholar and you search, you can quite often get the PDF for free.
That's quite interesting. I think it is one of those things about how we get business, academia and government to work more together, which the States is much better at in my time there. So it's quite interesting to see that. How do you sort of structure your days and the sources of information that you take in? Because you are... you do valuable work in terms of like, you go through a lot of these trends, reports, etc. Just how does Bruce structure his day?
I'm fortunate I get sent business books.
Yeah.
And so I probably read a business book a week.
Okay.
But the big thing for me is normally the citations. So what will happen is maybe I'll read a business book, and the thing, like, if there's any research that really stands out to me, I'm like, hang on, now that is fascinating. First thing I do, I go and find the citation of the paper. I go to the paper. I see what else that author's written. Is there stuff that I've not considered, I've not thought about? I'll give you a good example. Right now, I'm really interested in team dynamics. Sort of like, how can any boss make their team better? Because the thing you hear all the time is people say, yeah, team doesn't feel as good, and, you know, I don't want to force them into the office every day, but it just doesn't feel as energised as it used to be. So I'm always on the lookout for research of, you know, maybe someone who's done, I was reading something today before I came here today, of like someone who's done sports team analyses and worked out when the sports teams reported feeling more cohesive.
Yeah.
And was there anything that characterised that? So I was just reading one that said 2 weeks together for sports teams seemed to be transformational. That's really interesting. Yeah. Wonder what happened when the team was like spent 2 weeks together. But it might say to you, okay, so those company offsites where you travel somewhere, maybe that's more valuable now than it's ever been before.
Yeah.
And maybe like a 2-day trip to whether it's Butlins or Blackpool or Bermuda, but a 2-day trip might be a really big part of making your team feel cohesive. That's really interesting, especially if you can get any proof on that. So the next thing I'll do is that author there, maybe contact them. Could I chat to them? What else they're working on? So it's sort of that pursuit of trying to work out if there is a secret component to anything, really.
That's really interesting. Let's jump onto the sports thing and talk about Klopp, because that's what the final chapter's about. And I'm a football nut.
Who do you support?
Derby County.
Okay.
So not an amazing example. Although, having said that, the year that we almost went into administration, well, we did go into administration, and we were sort of deducted 21 points, I thought was a fascinating kind of like team dynamic led by Wayne Rooney at the time. Like, it was amazing. Like, the team were basically relegated in October and could have easily sort of given up and so on, but actually sort of ramshackle team sort of, almost kind of pulled it off. So I did find that quite interesting, and I think that's quite a British thing as well, of like backs up to the wall, like nothing to lose type thing. But yeah, who do you support?
Birmingham City.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing, so normally what you find is good cultures have got that strong sense they're all in it together. One of the things that can help that all in it together is when you feel like there's a common enemy. Yeah. Now, common enemy, you witness some people do this. They sort of, Microsoft for a long time decided Google was their enemy or Apple was their enemy. Like, if you can sometimes pick out some source of evil, and it might be, the libs are your enemy if you're Donald Trump, or, like choosing an enemy is often a good way to, it's often short term. Mourinho does it.
Yes,
it's short term because people after a while start thinking, is that all we are? It's just we're anti that lot.
Yeah.
What is it about us? But it's a good way to build a cohesive culture. So in that Derby case there, we've got no budget. No one wants us to succeed. Actually, they've taken all these points from us. But tell you what, we've got each other. And it's often quite a good way to build certainly works in the short term, siege mentality.
Yes.
A good cohesive culture.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. We did a big march, and that was against Birmingham City. That's why I sort of remembered it. So you talk about Klopp in the book, and it's interesting, like how he's built, or had built at Liverpool, a really great culture and so on. But there was a line in it that I thought was interesting, where you was saying how Klopp said to everyone, it's got to be like a family, got everyone from the training ground that works there to kind of come on stage and introduce themselves, etc. It was all really interesting. But can we read too much into business being like a family? Because isn't there a sort of separation, actually?
Yeah, most definitely. It's an imperfect metaphor and an imperfect comparison, because look, no matter how bad Christmas lunch is, you're not going to fire your mum, right? You're not going to cross certain boundaries. But it's why it's imprecise. But what you often find is good cultures do have a sense of connectedness, a sense of cohesion. So family is probably a bad thing. What Klopp often talked about, though, is his boys. And what that symbolised there is that quite often professional footballers don't talk to the manager. We don't necessarily know this, but Sir Alex Ferguson did not talk directly to his players.
Yes.
So some of that is status power. Some of that is like this separation. But, for example, when Wayne Rooney came to Birmingham City, he didn't talk to the players. He didn't address them. He didn't run training. So you've got this sort of separation there. Klopp, he's very intentionally, he put his arm around the players. He told them precisely what he was thinking. You see this with Steve Kerr in Golden State Warriors in the US. But he talked directly to them so that they felt seen. Yeah. They felt like they were part of something with him. Now, look, the very nature of football is like business in the sense that some people come in, some people go out. And so that's why, if people like Klopp are criticised, people often say, there's 3 years to his magic.
Yeah.
And then after about 3 years, his magic isn't quite as potent as it was before. Mourinho's had similar accusations that he can go in, he can do a hit, but if you want to build a legacy, the Guardiola-style legacy, you've got to do something that transcends that. But, so look, family...
Which is always changing as well,
That's
isn't
right.
it? So
That's
you
right.
can't... There is no...
Reinvent. So, Guardiola... Klopp did that that family thing. I think, it's always a bit imprecise, especially right now. Not everyone wants their work to feel like their family. But I think works can be a source of really good connection. It can be a source of bonding, but you just got to get the balance right in it, I think.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because this is what we were slightly having the ding-dong about when we did the live event, partly because we both agreed beforehand that there's nothing more boring than events where everyone just agrees with each other. So we were sort of deliberately trying to do it. But I was sort of making the case, which I think people were a bit surprised by, because I was sat there in my tie and so on, and I think people had sort of cast me as the kind of like ultra-capitalist with my background at that event. And I was actually saying that I think people should bring the personal into pay rises and so on. And I've reflected a bit more because he got such a kind of strong kickback from the audience as well. But it's interesting, of like, you need to be professional, you need to have all the kind of like commercials in place. But I've hardened in my view since then as well, that actually I do think it's important to share with your manager and so on, like your personal goals and so on. So it's where I sort of look, I guess I'm kind of veering over the place here by saying business is not like a family, but then you should also share with them your personal goals, which I suppose is why we find it all so wonderful and interesting that there's always different opinions on it. But what were your reflections on that sort of conversation that we had on?
So I think the pushback from the audience was that just because you're standing up saying, I want a new car next year, that's not your boss's problem, and your boss might not empathise with your desire for a lovely Caribbean holiday to the same extent that you do. So, or you want to get on the property ladder, or whatever it is that your boss won't necessarily empathise. I do err on the side that bosses quite often, they've got a route for you, but I don't necessarily think if you go in there and you talk about yourself and your needs, that it can escape the sense it's a bit of emotional blackmail. I think,
Yeah, that's fair.
If you go in there, you say, you won't believe this, but my dog's having puppies. That's kind of not your boss's fault.
Right, 2 final questions for you. I will let them take them in the order that you want. Is there a future job that you would like to do? Is there something that would tempt Bruce Daisley back into the corporate workplace? What do you think? And what's been your favourite business book of the last year?
Yeah, so job that would tempt me back. I'm sort of very interested in non-profit work. I'm very interested in sort of getting my hands involved in stuff like that. So, at one stage I did get down to the last candidates for a CEO of a very well-known non-profit, but it was before I left Twitter. That was while I was still at Twitter. And so, like, I wouldn't rule out something like that. I've got an interest in those things, non-exec or involved. And best business book actually is a book by a Turkish-American woman called Zeynep Ton. And it's called The Good Job Strategy. Really interesting hypothesis to it. There's 2 books now, Good Jobs Method and Good Job Strategy. Really interesting hypothesis. She started off as a professor of operations, just supply chain stuff. Really boring. It's just like, can you get it just in time? Can you save a couple of cents in the dollar on that? What you found was the most profitable, she was looking at retail chains, supermarkets, the most profitable weren't the ones with the best supply chains. They were the ones that focus on workplace culture. And so what she found was, she says, the number one thing that's ruinous to most companies is employee turnover. People quitting. If you're in retail, you can have up to 100% turnover a year, meaning people, on average, don't see out a year there. Very common in retail. 40% is like just getting started, but very common. Whereas stores like Waitrose, I think you had Mark Price here from Waitrose, they used to have like 8%, 4% employee turnover. And she was like, how do you get that? You make it a better place to work. And how do you do that? You make decisions. So, you make decisions about what you sell, about how your story's set up. The decisions that bosses in office work don't make about meetings.
Yeah.
We don't make these decisions. We don't intentionally design work. But the best supermarkets do intentionally design what work looks like. And I think Zenip Time's good job strategy, you probably get it for about £7-8. Absolutely fantastic book.
Really interesting.
Nice. I've got some quick fires.
I knew you were going to have some quick fires.
Okay, so first quick fire is... I was going to read it out.
Yeah, go for it.
Most surprising person who gave you career advice?
I'd say I got a good piece of advice, actually, which at the time I completely didn't think. William Berricker, who's now the chairman of Santander, was my boss at number 10. I remember him giving me some careers advice when I was getting ready to leave, and him saying that it's much easier to go from one job to another job. It's very hard to go from not having a job to having a job. And my gosh, he was right on that. And I completely underestimated that when I left.
Completely true, that, isn't it? You're
Yeah.
way more desirable when you've got a job.
When
than
you've
when
got,
you're,
like, it's a funny thing. I was just thinking that when I was asking you about your future job at the end, just like, whether people think of you now because, you're sort of, you're doing your own thing, which I actually think, personally, I've learned so much from doing my own thing in the last 4 or 5 years. But I can't remember the last time I was contacted about a job.
Yeah, I was given advice, always look busy. I think these days, that comes baked in, doesn't it? Everyone's busy all the time.
Completely. Next.
Best excuse to skip a meeting?
The funny thing about meetings and you think before you attend them, your absence will be really noticed. And after, like if I've just missed that meeting, no one noticed. Someone will send you an email saying, here's what you missed. And actually you get away without going to a lot more meetings. I've met people in organisations and they've said, oh yeah, my job's way less stressful than it should be because I just don't go to half the meetings I'm invited to.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Most of us don't realise that we've got the choice not to go to some of them.
I think that's true. I can share with you a funny story of a meeting. We used to have meet with the Prime Minister at 8 a.m. in the morning. Sometimes I would go to that meeting, sometimes I wouldn't because business wasn't always a core part of what needed to be discussed necessarily, not like the Director of Comms or something like that. And I went, and my wife was calling me like repeatedly during it, and I was like, decline, I'm in with the PM. And she was like, call me now. And I was like, oh my gosh, right. So sort of jumped out of the room and called her, and she said, oh, I think I'm pregnant. Now, it wasn't unusual for people to leave a meeting with the Prime Minister, actually, because people have got stuff, these are the important people trying to sort stuff out and whatever. What was highly unusual was what I did next, was I went back into the meeting, because people really didn't do that. If you left a meeting with the Prime Minister, it was not expected to be that. And I remember Alex Dawson was standing next to me, the political director, and he was like, oh, how many jobs lost is that? And I just said to him, I think just mine in 9 months' time. We were not expecting it. We'd only been married a couple of months.
Okay.
That's gonna be a good clip, I think.
We'll see.
Funniest excuse for being late that you've heard?
It's ironic you asking this.
that was a question of Bruce.
Yeah, I've definitely had a group of employees who've buried several grandmothers. And, my first rule of excuses is if someone uses 2 excuses, they're telling a lie. So if someone says, sorry, I can't come to your party, I can't get a babysitter, and I'm feeling unwell. Well, either of those would have been fine on their own. But if they've grouped them together, it's because they're like, that won't be convincing enough. So my rule is 2 excuses means it's a lie.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. Best reason for being late. I'd say it's not really a story, but like, well, it's not a reason for it not being late. But I remember taking these business delegations on these trips with the PM on RAF Voyager, and me giving a talk at the start of it, just being like, "Look, I appreciate you guys are used to being the most important person in the room, but that isn't going to be the case on this trip." And the plane leaves when the plane leaves, and they all sort of giggled along, and I was like, I have run 3 trade delegations. On 2 of those trips, I've not returned with full delegations because we've left people behind.
Wow.
So, like, that was quite a thing.
A famous person you'd love to do a podcast with, as my host.
Oh, and we should ask, who's your favourite one that you've had on Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat?
The thing about my podcast is that by the very nature of workplace culture, I'm a little bit skeptical about leaders who want to grab the limelight on it. So actually, like, there's no big celebrity names really on mine. I don't sort of
Scott Calloway?
Yeah, I mean, but like, he's an exception rather than the case. Like, I generally don't do it, but I am always interested in people who do interesting things in business or different things in business. So especially to hear it firsthand. So when you hear of iconic businesses like Patagonia, or you'd love to chat to the people right at the heart of them, but. It's not really a celeb podcast.
No.
I'd love to chat to Tony Blair, but he wouldn't necessarily fit my format, really.
No, I know what you mean. I tell you what, one of the podcasts that I'm keen to do is I would love to do like the first employee at places. I think that'd be really interesting because we lionise founders, right? And rightly so, they take a huge amount of risk and so on. But the person first in is almost taking as much risk without the potential upside as well. I just think it's really interesting. And you talk about first, several hundred people at Twitter and all those people at Google and whatever must have some fantastic tales, and that stuff doesn't get told as much.
Yeah.
Last one, controversial one. If someone offered you the presidency, so you'd de facto replace Trump, would you take it?
I mean, if someone's offering you the presidency, you'd be bananas not to give it a go, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
What would you ban? I would ban the clock going back.
Yeah.
I would ban...
So I'd reduce it. I think that I read something about this, that you could reduce it actually for sort of 6 weeks of the year. So you'd make it a kind of like end of November to sort of mid-Jan thing.
I mean, that's worse, isn't it?
Oh yeah, but it's over and done with. I mean, it is hard at the moment. I mean, it is. It's hard.
What would you ban? What would you, if you were the president? And would you take the job if you were after the presidency?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would, but I think if I was offered it, I think it's a tough job. Having seen the PM's job up close, it's pretty brutal.
Well, it's the line that the Queen said to Johnson springs to mind when she said, "I don't know why you'd want this job."
Yeah.
Because it doesn't seem to give whoever covets it what they hoped for.
Well, they want, and I think as well, like, part of it has got so much tougher with all the stuff that we've been talking about in terms of meetings, demands, people expecting it, etc. Blair didn't say this on my podcast, but he said it on other ones about like the sort of ceremonial side of the job has increased like a lot as well in terms of that side of things as well. Which is perhaps a kind of modern day equivalent. What would I ban? Pineapple on pizzas?